Imagine discovering that, for almost 2,000 years, fundamental parts of Jesus' teachings may have been left out of the story we were told. Not by chance, not by error, but by human, political, and religious choices. Now think about the impact of this experienced academics, scholars of early Christianity, and experts on ancient manuscripts being surprised by a document that simply shouldn't exist. But does. In 2023, a discovery in the northern highlands of Ethiopia reignited debates that many believed had ended since the Council of Nicaea in 325. An Ethiopian manuscript, preserved silently for centuries, began to reveal words attributed to Jesus that do not appear in any Western Bible. Intimate words. Final words. Teaching said far from the crowds, far from the altars, far from institutional power. And here comes the uncomfortable question: if these teachings were so central to spiritual transformation, why were they left out? What exactly did Jesus teach his disciples in Gethsemane, in the most decisive moments, when there was no longer room for public speeches, only for profound truths? The answer can affect not only theology, but the way you understand faith, spirituality, and even your own inner journey. While you follow this story, enjoy and write in the comments where you are talking about now. It's always impressive to see how this search for meaning connects people from all over the world, from small towns to large metropolises, all united by the same curiosity. What makes this discovery even more disturbing is that it arises not from rumors or modern theories, but from actual scrolls, written in Gs, analyzed with carbon-14 dating, carbon ink, and rigorous paleography methods. No guesswork. Just facts that challenge ancient certainties and force us to look at early Christianity with new eyes. And perhaps most uncomfortable of all is this: if Jesus taught that the kingdom of God is within you, why do we spend centuries learning to seek it outside? Stay with me until the end, because this story isn't just about an old manuscript, it's about what may have been forgotten within us. The discovery of the Ethiopian manuscript in 2023 did not come with fanfare, cameras, or sensational headlines. On the contrary, it began almost silently, like so many important things in history. Amid the highlands of northern Ethiopia, researchers working with manuscripts from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church came across something that didn't fit into the known catalogs. It was older, denser, and, above all, different from anything that had ever been studied. The impact was immediate among experts. Paleographers, historians of early Christianity in Ethiopia, and scholars of the Aksumite period quickly realized that they were not faced with yet another common liturgical text. The internal references, structure, and vocabulary pointed to something much deeper: a gospel in dialogue format, with words attributed to Jesus in an intimate and final context of his life. What caught the most attention was the state of the ancient Ethiopian codex. Despite its age, the manuscript seemed to have survived the centuries practically intact. It was not just a historical relic, but a living testimony to a Christianity that flourished outside the Roman axis. This reinforced an idea that many academics had already been defending: the diversity of early Christianity was much greater than is normally taught. Here it is worth a practical reflection. How many times have you accepted a version of the story without question? This discovery invites us to do the opposite: develop the habit of investigating, comparing sources, and listening to forgotten voices. If you want to get started, books on lost Christianities or on the formation of the biblical canon are a great first step in expanding this vision. The monastery of Gunda Gunde, also known as Gunda Gunde, is not an easy place to reach, and perhaps for this very reason it has become a silent guardian of spiritual treasures. Nestled in the northern highlands of Ethiopia, among the monasteries of Tigray, it appears to have been designed for isolation. Narrow trails, rugged terrain, and centuries of monastic life have pushed aside the modern world, creating an environment where time runs at a different pace. This historical isolation was not only geographic, but also cultural and theological. While Christianity in the West went through councils, power struggles, and doctrinal standardization, communities like Gunda Gunde continued to preserve much older traditions. There, early Christianity in Ethiopia maintained direct links with the Aksumite period, far from the political pressures of Rome or Constantinople. It is in this context that the manuscripts of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church gained unique importance. The monks did not see these texts as historical relics but as living instruments of spirituality. Reading, copying, and preserving manuscripts was a form of prayer. This helps to understand why so many texts considered non-canonical Gospels in the West have survived there, intact, across generations. There is a powerful practical lesson here. In a noisy world, where everything competes for our attention, conscious isolation can be an act of inner preservation. Separating moments of silence, study, and reflection, even if just a few minutes a day, can be the first step towards accessing deeper layers of understanding. And this idea sets the stage for the next point, where a simple object kept silent will change everything. Gunda Gunde's manuscript was not displayed on shelves or in showcases, much less catalogued prominently. It rested forgotten inside a codex in a leather bag, a common practice in Tigray monasteries, where texts considered sensitive were protected not only from the weather, but also from prying eyes. This seemingly simple detail ended up being decisive for its preservation over the centuries. The leather bag acted as a time capsule. The ancient Ethiopian codex, composed of carefully prepared parchment folios, remained protected from moisture, excessive light, and constant handling. It wasn't carelessness, it was zeal. For the monks, that text had profound spiritual value, even if its content was not read publicly in liturgies. When researchers opened the codex, they realized that it was no ordinary gospel. The organization of the text, the flow of speeches, and the absence of traditional narrative structures indicated a gospel in dialogue format. Jesus does not appear as a distant figure, but as a master in direct conversation with the disciples, transmitting Jesus' final teachings in an intimate and reflective tone. Here comes a powerful parallel with modern life. How much valuable knowledge is stored in leather bags within us, forgotten by the daily rush. Making a habit of revisiting old notes, spiritual rereadings, or even personal reflections can reveal insights that were already there all along. And this prepares us for the next step, understanding how experts were able to decipher and authenticate this extraordinary text. When the codex came out of the leather bag, the first challenge was understanding exactly what was in front of them. This is where the meticulous work of paleographers, specialists in analyzing ancient writing, comes into play. Every stroke, every curve of the letters in GZ was observed with a magnifying glass, compared with other manuscripts from the same period, and compared with styles known from early Christianity in Ethiopia. Paleography revealed something impressive. The shape of the letters, the spacing between words, and even small variations in writing pointed to a manuscript from the 4th or early 5th century, an extremely sensitive period in Christian history. This placed the text very close to the post-Council of Nicaea phase, when the formation of the biblical canon was still in dispute and many Christian texts circulated freely before being suppressed. In addition to writing, codicology came into play to analyze the physical structure of the manuscript. The parchment folios, the way they were sewn, the sequence of the notebooks, and even the signs of use indicated a text produced with extreme care. It was neither a draft nor a hasty copy, but an ancient Ethiopian codex made to last and be handed down with reverence. This process teaches us something applicable to personal life. Before accepting or rejecting an idea, it is worth observing the details, going beyond the surface. Just as paleographers do not draw quick conclusions, we can also develop the habit of better analyzing information, beliefs, and even important decisions. This critical and patient stance makes room for the next point, where science and spirituality meet definitively. One of the big questions that arises from this discovery is simple and powerful: how did such an ancient manuscript survive for so long? The answer lies in the way the manuscripts of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church have always been treated. In the northern highlands of Ethiopia, preserving sacred texts has never been just an academic matter, but an ongoing spiritual act, almost a silent vow passed down from generation to generation. The dry climate of mountainous regions, combined with traditional storage techniques, created ideal conditions for conservation. Ancient Ethiopian codices were kept away from direct light, protected in leather bags, and handled only at specific times. This explains why so many manuscripts from the Aksumite period have come down to us in surprising condition, while similar texts have been lost in other regions of the Christian world. In addition to the environment, there was a very clear mentality: these texts did not belong to individuals, but to the community and collective spiritual memory. Therefore, even during wars, invasions, and political crises, the monks in Tigray monasteries prioritized saving the manuscripts. Many were hidden, transported at night, or temporarily buried to ensure their survival. There is a direct application here for modern life. What are you preserving today for your inner future? Readings, reflections, spiritual learning? Creating a small weekly study or silence ritual can be the contemporary equivalent of these ancient practices. If this story is making sense to you, comment here if you had already heard about the preservation of Ethiopian manuscripts or if this is completely new. And take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, because the next part delves even deeper into this mystery. To understand the real weight of this manuscript, it is impossible to ignore the language in which it was written. Ge'ez or GZ is not just an ancient language, is the Ethiopian liturgical language, used for centuries in the tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Just like Latin in the West or Koine Greek in the Mediterranean, Ge'ez was the vehicle for transmitting the sacred, teaching, and spiritual memory. Most fascinating is that Ge'ez preserves spiritual concepts that simply do not find direct equivalents in modern languages. Terms linked to spiritual light, gnosis, pleroma, and inner transformation appear with very specific nuances. This completely changes the reading of Jesus' secret teachings, as the vocabulary points less to dogma and more to direct experience of the divine. This detail reinforces something important: early Christianity in Ethiopia was not a copy of the Roman model, but a living and autonomous expression of the Christian faith. During the Aksumite period, Ethiopia already had its own theological identity, deeply connected to the idea of inner awakening, theosis, and deification, concepts also central to the theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church. In practice, this invites us to look more carefully at the translations we consume today. Reading different versions of the same text, studying the origins of words, and even knowing key terms in ancient languages can drastically expand spiritual understanding. And this attention to linguistic detail sets the stage for the next point, where modern science and ancient manuscripts meet in a decisive way. After the initial impact, the inevitable question came: how to prove that the manuscript was really ancient. The answer was carbon-14 dating, carried out with scientific rigor. Minimal samples of the parchment folios were analyzed by radiocarbon dating in Oxford, consistently pointing to a 4th or early 5th century manuscript. This placed the codex squarely at the heart of disputes over Christian texts after Nicaea. The analysis of old paint reinforced the result. Experts identified lamp-black carbon ink, common in late antique manuscripts from the Mediterranean and Northeast Africa. There were no signs of modern pigments, chemical adulteration, or subsequent reuse. Each trace confirmed authenticity and dispelled suspicions of late forgery. Paleography returned to the scene to cross scientific data with writing style. Letters, ligatures, and proportions were compared with other known ancient Ethiopian codices. The result was coherent. The manuscript fit perfectly into the horizon of early Christianity in Ethiopia, at a time when many texts were still circulating before being classified as apocryphal or suppressed. Here comes a powerful practical lesson: faith and science do not need to compete. Just as this manuscript was validated with method, we can also apply clear criteria to our beliefs, decisions, and life choices. Questioning, investigating, and confirming does not weaken spirituality, it strengthens it. And this leads us directly to the next point, where the historical context further amplifies the impact of this discovery. To understand why this manuscript causes so much discomfort, it is necessary to place it in the right time. It appears precisely in the post-Council of Nicaea period, in 325, when Christianity underwent a decisive turn. From then on, faith stopped being just a diverse spiritual path and also became an institutional project, with well-defined boundaries about what could or could not be taught. In this context, the formation of the biblical canon began to take on more rigid contours. Texts that emphasized inner experience, gnosis, and spiritual transformation began to be viewed with suspicion. Decades later, Athanasius' Festal Letter 39 would consolidate an official list of books, pushing many non-canonical Gospels to the margins of history. The Gunda Gunde manuscript appears to have escaped exactly this process. What draws attention is that the content of the codex does not come into direct confrontation with Jesus, but with the model of Christianity that was being formed. Instead of central authority, he speaks of conscience. Instead of priestly mediation, it points to the divine spark within each person. This helps to understand why texts like these were classified as apocryphal or simply left aside. In practice, this point invites us to reflect on how power structures shape narratives. How many profound ideas have been softened, adjusted, or silenced over time? Developing the habit of studying the historical context, not just the final text, can completely transform the way you understand faith, the Bible, and spirituality. And this prepares us for the next topic, where the form of teaching becomes as important as the content. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Gunda Gunde manuscript is its format. Unlike traditional narrative gospels, it presents itself as a gospel in dialogue format. There are no big speeches to crowds, no parables staged in squares. Here, Jesus speaks directly to his disciples, in intimate conversations, almost like a teacher guiding students in the final moments before a great transition. This detail changes everything. Dialogue creates closeness, humanity, and urgency. Jesus' final teachings are not presented as external rules, but as interior guidelines, adjusted to the disciples' real doubts. Questions arise, answers are deepened, and the focus is less on what to believe and more on how to transform. He is a teaching Jesus, not a judge. There are clear references to Gethsemane as a symbolic backdrop to these teachings. A space of silence, tension, and inner decision. In this context, Jesus' hidden words gain different weight, because they are not said to convince, but to prepare. Prepare for pain, for physical absence, and, above all, for a spiritual awakening that would no longer depend on the external presence of the Master. This dialogical format offers us a simple and powerful practice for today. Instead of just consuming ready-made content, how about having a dialogue with the texts you read? Write down questions, write answers, talk to yourself while reading. This habit transforms any spiritual study into a living experience. And it is exactly this vivacity that leads us to the next point, where an apparently simple sentence reveals itself as one of the deepest cores of this manuscript. Among the most striking passages in Gunda Gunde's manuscript is the insistent return to an idea that sounds simple, but is deeply subversive: the kingdom within you. The phrase directly echoes Luke 17:21, "The kingdom of God is within you," but here it appears expanded, commented, almost unfolded into layers of meaning. Not as a distant metaphor, but as practical guidance for everyday spiritual transformation. In the dialogue, Jesus does not point to temples, positions, or rituals as gateways to the kingdom. He directs the gaze inwards, towards consciousness, towards what the text calls the divine spark. This language speaks to the tradition of theosis and deification, very present in the theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church, where salvation is not just forgiveness, but real participation in divine life. The vocabulary used with echoes of gnosis, pleroma, and spiritual light does not suggest escape from the world, but an inner awakening in the midst of it. The kingdom does not arrive in the distant future, it reveals itself when a person learns to see, discern, and act from within. This completely shifts spirituality from the field of waiting to the field of experience. In practice, this teaching can be lived today in a simple way. Daily moments of silence, full attention before important decisions, observation of your own thoughts and reactions. Small practices that train the consciousness to recognize this inner kingdom in action. And this change of axis from external to internal takes us directly to the next point, where this spirituality comes into open tension with institutional Christianity. As the Gunda Gunde manuscript progresses, the tension between inner spirituality and institutional Christianity becomes increasingly clear. Jesus appears emphasizing transformation, awareness, and inner awakening, while making subtle but firm warnings about the danger of reducing faith to external structures. There are no direct attacks, but there are very well-defined contrasts between living spirit and empty ritual. The text suggests that when spiritual experience is replaced by rigid rules and absolute hierarchies, something essential is lost. The criticism is not of the community or the tradition itself, but of the excessive dependence on priestly mediation. Access to the divine, according to these secret teachings of Jesus, should not be monopolized by positions, titles, or institutions. This view speaks to other suppressed Christian texts, such as those found in the Nag Hammadi library. Gospels such as Thomas and Mary also emphasize inner knowledge and the direct experience of spiritual light. Together, They point to a mystical Christianity that coexisted and often conflicted with the institutional model that ended up predominating. Here it is worth asking a practical and honest question: is your spirituality alive or just organized? Creating spaces for personal experience, reflective reading, silence, conscious prayer can restore depth to faith, regardless of the tradition you follow. If this contrast between inner spirituality and institutional religion is moving you, comment here what has caught your attention the most so far and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey. The next point further deepens this tension with names and central characters in the story. One of the most sensitive and at the same time most revealing elements of the Gunda Gunde manuscript is the recurring presence of Mary Magdalene in Jesus' inner circle. Unlike the image constructed centuries later, here she does not appear as a peripheral or symbolic figure, but as an active disciple, a direct participant in dialogues and deeper reflections on spiritual transformation. The text suggests that Mary Magdalene had a refined understanding of inner teachings, often capturing nuances that other disciples were slow to assimilate. This strongly echoes what already appears in texts such as the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, where she appears as a reference for spiritual maturity. The idea of spiritual equality between men and women is not defended as a modern flag, but presented as something natural in primitive Christianity. This point helps to dismantle a narrative constructed later, in which the role of women was progressively reduced. The manuscript reinforces that, in the first Christian movements, spiritual authority was linked to conscience and experience, not to gender. This explains why figures like Mary Magdalene became uncomfortable when the institutional hierarchy began to consolidate. There is a direct application here for today. How many voices have you stopped hearing because of cultural, social, or religious filters? Revisiting history honestly teaches us to recognize wisdom where we were once told not to look. And this revaluation of living teaching leads us to the next point, where Jesus' own mission is reinterpreted in a profound and transformative way. In the Gunda Gunde manuscript, the figure of Jesus moves away from the exclusive image of sacrifice and approaches, very clearly, the role of master of inner transformation. This does not mean denying the crucifixion, but expanding its meaning. The focus of the text is less on death itself and more on the path of consciousness that Jesus taught before death, as someone who shows the path and invites his disciples to follow it. This approach enters into direct dialogue with the debate on the theory of substitutionary atonement, developed centuries later by Anselm of Canterbury. In the ancient Ethiopian codex, there is no emphasis on inherited guilt or debt to be paid, but on lived example. Jesus teaches how to overcome fear, pain, and illusion, awakening to a spiritual body, an idea that clearly echoes 1 Corinthians 15. The text presents the resurrection not only as a future physical event, but as a process of spiritual awakening accessible in the present. The transformation begins now, in the way of thinking, acting, and perceiving reality. This aligns with the theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church, where salvation is participation in divine life, not simple legal absolution. In practice, this vision changes everything. Instead of asking what was done for me, the question becomes what is being awakened in me. Practices such as self-knowledge, responsibility for one's own choices, and coherence between faith and action gain centrality, and this change of axis sets the stage for the next point, where Jesus makes direct warnings about religious power, hierarchies, and spiritual traps as the dialogues progress. The Gunda Gunde manuscript reveals an increasingly direct tone in Jesus' warnings, is not about rejecting rituals or communities, but about exposing the danger when church hierarchies begin to replace the living experience of the Spirit. The text criticizes the transformation of faith into a control system, where positions, titles, and norms become more important than awakened conscience. Jesus appears warning that empty rituals can give the illusion of closeness to the divine, while distancing a person from themselves. When the external gesture is not born from an internal transformation, it becomes mechanical repetition. This contrast between ritual and living spirit runs throughout the manuscript, echoing similar criticisms found in suppressed Christian texts and non-canonical Gospels. The criticism of priestly mediation is also cleared. Access to the kingdom, according to these secret teachings of Jesus, should not depend on exclusive intermediaries. Each person is called to recognize the divine spark within themselves, taking direct responsibility for their spiritual journey. This explains why ideas like this have Become uncomfortable in contexts of increasing religious centralization. Here comes a simple but profound practical application. Evaluate your spiritual practices. Do they bring you closer to more awareness, or just relieve guilt for a few minutes? Replacing quantity with presence, less automatic rituals, and more real attention can completely transform the experience of faith. This questioning leads us to the last point, where the impact of this discovery expands beyond theology and reaches our historical understanding of Christianity. The impact of the discovery of the Ethiopian Manuscript in 2023 goes far beyond momentary academic excitement. It forces historians, theologians, and ordinary readers to revisit the idea that there has been a single, homogeneous Christianity from the beginning. On the contrary, what the Gunda Gunde manuscript highlights is the profound diversity of early Christianity, with multiple voices, practices, and understandings living side by side. Ancient Ethiopian codex reinforces that many lost Christianity did not disappear due to lack of spiritual value, but due to historical and political decisions. Texts that emphasized inner transformation, gnosis, and spiritual equality ended up classified as non-canonical gospels or apocryphal texts, while others were elevated to the status of norm. The manuscript thus becomes a key piece for understanding what was left out in the formation of the biblical canon. The discovery also speaks directly to modern initiatives to digitize ancient manuscripts. Projects like the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library have revealed Ethiopia's manuscript treasures to the world, allowing texts previously restricted to isolated monasteries to be studied globally. This opens a new phase, where the past is no longer the property of a few and becomes shared heritage. In practice, this rediscovery invites us to a more humble and open stance. Instead of looking for ready-made answers, we are called to listen, compare, and reflect. Perhaps the greatest impact of this manuscript is not what it proves, but what it asks us: what kind of Christianity do we want to live today? And this question, far from ending the story, keeps the flame of curiosity and awakening alive. After traveling this journey, one thing becomes clear: this discovery is not just about an ancient manuscript kept in the highlands of northern Ethiopia. She talks about how faith may have been reduced to formulas, when perhaps it has always been an invitation to inner awakening. If the kingdom of God is within you, as this manuscript insists on repeating, the big question is, what have you done to access it on a daily basis? Throughout history, we have seen how words were preserved, hidden, copied by hand, protected in leather bags, going through centuries of silence. Now imagine how many teachings, perceptions, and intuitions are also stored within you, waiting for the right moment to be revisited. What practices, habits, or beliefs can you start to question today to live a more alive and conscious spirituality? This manuscript challenges us to exchange dependence for responsibility, fear for transformation, and repetition for presence. It's not about abandoning traditions, but about rediscovering the spirit that gave rise to them. Perhaps the true final teaching of Jesus is not something to just be believed, but lived, step by step, from the inside out. If this content expanded your vision, provoked questions, or awakened something inside, don't let it die now. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue this journey with us. Here, each video is an invitation to go beyond the surface and rediscover what was forgotten in history and in yourself.